back to Set Streets and Needs, guys. I'm Chris Bauer. I am here in Abilene, Kansas. I am here to visit the Dwight D. Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum. Really just the library, or the museum part. The library at this particular presidential property is a separate building. So you of course need to schedule a time to come research at any presidential library. But it is in its own building. At one end, that's the library, and then at the other end is the museum. I'm out in front of the statue of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the 34th President of the United States, who was actually born named David Dwight Eisenhower after his father. He was a junior. But it quickly, his family called him Dwight to differentiate the two Davids in the house. Then the Dwight and the name stuck. Ike, early on, a nickname from childhood, stuck his entire life. And it just eventually got switched to Dwight David Eisenhower, Dwight D. Eisenhower. And that's that. So Dwight Eisenhower was, of course, the 34th President of the United States. He was 1952 was when he was elected. It was right after, several years after World War II. He was a huge World War II hero, five-star general, I believe. Rose in the ranks and became a hero to the American people. He was president until John Fitzgerald Kennedy won his election bid in 1960. And after that, President Eisenhower, I believe, was only alive another 9 years. He died in 1969. So very full life of public service. He joined the military back in 1915 or 1917. So his entire adult life was in the service of the American military and then the American general public. So I'm going to head into the museum and learn some history about the 34th President of the United States, and I hope you guys will join me. Let's travel. Goes over his early childhood in Abilene here. This is him in his West Point class. This was, of course, Mammy Dowd, who he would marry for their lifelong marriage. Their wedding clothing. She was from Denver. He was just a Kansas farm boy. This is cool.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. A vital element in keeping the peace is our military establishment. Our arms must be mighty, ready for instant action, so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction. Our military organization today bears little relation to that known of any of my predecessors in peacetime. or indeed by the fighting men of World War II or Korea. Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
Eisenhower came up through the tank corps. That's where he got his start in the military. Oh, wow. Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. That would have been something to do in 1915, or 1919. Very few roads. Wow. So the War Department behind me during World War II, there was multiple buildings, many buildings, but you'll see them really close to the Washington Monument. And that's actually because they were literally built along with now the reflecting pool down the National Mall. Both sides of it had multiple buildings that were built for the War Department during the war. They've long since been torn down, and now the Vietnam Memorial's there, forests, beautiful rolling hills, but those all used to be war buildings during the Second World War. You can still see the indoor garden, the Grand Garden there in Washington. It's kind of behind buildings now. You wouldn't be able to see it from a photo in that perspective, but that's pretty neat. But all those buildings now are gone. Long gone. Looks a lot better now. Eisenhower worked as an assistant, war assistant to General MacArthur in the Philippines just prior to World War II, and then during as well. So he got to know the Filipino people and that whole theater of war in the early 1940s. So behind me is examples of all the different firepower and uniforms that all the branches of the military used during World War II. We had a lot of them. A lot of innovation during that time too. A lot of these weapons, I guess the technology was accelerated due to war and due to need and being able to test these things out on the battlefield. So, of course, a big part of that was money. So he was a very pivotal part in helping sell war bonds and raising the money to get Americans involved in the war effort. Of course, you have all the different, I guess, propaganda in a good way, but the different pieces of marketing, let's call it marketing, war marketing, they would use. Rosie the Riveter, of course, talking about women taking up the man's role of working in the factories, making those weapons or cars or tanks or whatever, and getting back into the war effort and backing and helping it. It was every hand on deck, so to speak. So he he started the war, I believe, as a major or a captain, I can't remember, and then rose to Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary? He rose to Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, which was he was a 5-star general by the end of the war. Wow. Well, here's something crazy, is my parents used to, or maybe still have this exact table and chairs, except it's not brass, it's just wood on the feet. Wow. Yeah, that is exactly the table and chairs. Look at that.
During the long lane of the history yet to be written, America knows that this world of ours, ever growing smaller, must avoid becoming a community of dreadful fear and hate, and be instead a proud confederation of mutual trust and respect. Such a confederation must be one of equals. The weakest must come to the conflict. Together we must learn how to compose differences, not with arms, but with intellect and decent purpose. Because this need is so sharp and apparent, I confess that I lay down my official responsibilities in this field with a definite sense of disappointment. As one who has witnessed the horror and the lingering sadness of war, as one who knows that another war could utterly destroy this civilization which has been so slowly and painfully built over thousands of years, I wish I could say tonight that a lasting peace is in sight. Happily, I can say that war has been avoided. Steady progress toward our ultimate goal has been made, but so much remains to be done. As a private citizen, I shall never cease to do what little I can to help the world advance along that road. To all the peoples of the world, I once more give expression to America's prayerful and continuing aspiration. We pray that peoples of all faiths, all races, all nations may have their great human needs satisfied, that those now denied opportunity shall come to enjoy it to the full, that all who yearn for freedom may experience its spiritual blessings, that all who are insensitive to the needs of others will learn charity, and that the sources, scourges of poverty, disease, and ignorance will be made disappear from the earth, and that in the goodness of time all peoples will come to live together in a peace guaranteed by the binding force of mutual respect and love.
These are some of the awards that Eisenhower received after the war. Wow, that's a lot. Oh, and this is the places on the map where he did the service that won the award. Look at that. He was in North Africa for a while. Definitely the European theater. That's amazing. A leather portfolio noting his 5-star general status. So Truman, President Truman, he had Eisenhower move to Washington, and he served as the Army Chief of Staff, one of the Joint Chiefs. Interesting. I've been to Gettysburg a couple of times, and I have noticed that the Eisenhower home is there. And that's interesting. He actually bought the home himself, and they had purchased a farm there at Gettysburg. It was the first and only home they owned. That's interesting. So the boyhood home here is his childhood home, which was owned by his family, and then the trust that's over this property. But the only home he ever bought was in Gettysburg. That's very interesting. I know that you can visit that home in Gettysburg. I've been past it several times. And of course, the I Like Ike campaign, and it was effective. Chicago had the Republican National Convention in 1952. He accepted the nomination for the Republican Party to run for president with Richard Milhouse Nixon as his vice president, and they won handily. All the ashtrays and piggy banks, the I Like Ike ties and hats, and all those campaign buttons. Look at that. I Like Ike. It helps when it rhymes. that's cool. Oh, this is the Bible that he was sworn in on, it looks like. Yeah. He was sworn in using that Bible. It's a gift from his mother. And then this was their inauguration suit and Mammy's clothes as well. This is a section about Mammy. Mammy Eisenhower.
In 1979, Mamie gave an interview to Barbara Walters.
His integrity,
Wow.
his admiration for mankind.
You can tell even 10 years after his death,
To remember Mrs. Eisenhower.
she really loved him.
Oh, that's the sweet.
This was just before her death in 1979. She had very classic style. Definitely that 40s, 50s, and 60s American housewife style. Very beautiful. Some other dishes and china. Life after Ike. She's recalled saying, when Ike died, the light went out of my life. She returned to Abilene every year on the anniversary of his death. Wow. Look at that. What a ballroom. The Easter egg roll. So, obviously the Korean War happened during Ike's presidency. But he was able to end it, get America out of it eventually. I think of course, the Cold War was in full swing when he was president. But I think the thing his presidency had, I guess the lasting legacy, I don't think is war related for his presidency. I think it's the fact that he is the administration that came up with our interstate system. All of our interstate system are actually Eisenhower highways. I'm sure it was informed by his trek in 1919, the military convoy across the U.S. from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. That had to be brutal because very few roads connected. States would just come up with their own roads. Some of them were paved, and then you get to other states, the same type of road would be just a foot-worn path through a forest. So there was no rhyme or reason to any of the highway systems. So he came up with his administration came up with the interstate system that we have today. I-75, I-70, I-10, whatever. I saw a meme recently that people are just realizing or learning that our interstate system, there's a rhyme or reason to the numbers that are behind it. And this was the Eisenhower system. But basically, all of the east to west highways start at the bottom of the U.S. I-10, I-20, I-30, all the way up to I-90 at the top of the U.S. that goes all the way across. And then the roads that go from east to west, north to south, end in 5. So you have I-75, I-95, I-65, I-55. And then the other roads with that are usually a 7 or whatever that end in those are usually interstate highways, or 9 is a common one too. But interstate highways and things like that are, built by the states, but the actual federal interstates actually have a numbering system, and clearly that's the only way to build them. And apparently people today are just discovering this. You actually still see these signs today all over every U.S. highway. You just probably haven't noticed them. Space race started under his watch. Sputnik was put up first. It beat the American version into space. Of course, Kennedy would continue that, as would Johnson, as would Nixon, and by 1969 we had put a man on the moon, effectively ending the space race. Declaring ourselves as winners with a nice flag on the moon. He also started was a proponent of the Civil Rights Movement with the Civil Rights Act in 1957. It was the first act that started, I'm not exactly sure what it did, but it was definitely one of the first legislation pieces for civil rights since, well, probably for 20 or 30 years before that. Here's our interstate system. Like I said, you have I-10 running all the way across with I-90 going across the very top there. And then the ones in the N5, I-95, I-75, I-65, 85, 55, 45, 35, and it goes on and on and on. All the way to I-5 in California. So you oversaw a very big decade of change. This is interesting. 1950, only 9% of TVs, households had TV. 10 years later, 87%. A lot of prosperity, money, technology, innovation started after World War II. It was a huge booming era in American life. That's interesting too. 1950, only 40 million cars existed. 1960, 61 million cars existed. 20 million cars in just 10 years. All these are other statistics about jobs and college and all that stuff rose during the 1950s. The television one's interesting because Eisenhower was the first president to have a televised news conference. In fact, it's on right now, 1955. First time that Americans could actually see a president take questions from the press, and how a president would banter and have that relationship with the press, which is obviously now a part of our everyday lives now, but 70 plus years ago, he was the first one to do it. That's cool. This is his farewell speech, leaving office in 1961, and they made his image out of the words in it. That's neat. After his presidency, he definitely wrote several books. Of course, bought the house at Gettysburg. And then was laid in state in 1969 after his death. This picture was taken from the top of the rotunda and then brought here to be interred here in Abilene, Kansas, in the place of meditation right here on this property. They have his funeral carriage flag that was folded right over his funeral. That's in the place of meditation. They're standing right where he is interred today. And then the last shell from the 21 gun salute.
This way must avoid government by bureaucracy as carefully as it avoids neglect.
He was around for the dedication of his boyhood home and presidential library. 1962, I think they did. Maybe it was 61. That was pretty neat. I think my memories dealing with Ike, clearly, obviously, I have none of myself, but I do remember my dad, and because my dad was born in 1949, so basically his whole childhood up to age 10, Ike was president. And then my mom was born during the Eisenhower presidency. So I remember them making comments about, I like Ike. It was a very popular saying for them when they were kids. And I remember my grandparents mentioning it from time to time. So I have a lot of nostalgia built into the name Dwight Eisenhower, or Ike Eisenhower, which is kind of neat for me. Just has a lot of that familiarity, the nostalgia built into it. So directly behind me is the boyhood home of Dwight D. Eisenhower. He was not born here, he was born in Texas, but from age 2 on lived here in Abilene. His mother died in 1946. leaving the family home empty for the first time, which was then purchased, and then later the Presidential Museum and Library grounds were built around it. So that is the oldest structure on the property. And then everything else came later, obviously. They're doing a major renovation in it right now, inside and out. The Presidential Museum was actually renovated in 2019, so now it's the Boyhood Home's turn. And hopefully in a future visit I'll be able to stop back by and see how it looks. So one of the buildings here on the property is called the Place of Meditation. This is actually where the Eisenhower family is entombed. President Eisenhower lays next to his wife and their young son, who died, I think, at the age of 4, of scarlet fever. He's interred here as well. They're all three together in eternity. This is unique from the other presidential burial places I've seen at the different libraries, because those are normally outside overlooking a hill or the property that the library's on, something like that. This is the first one I've seen that's inside, and it's very fitting. Eisenhowers were very religious, so to have a church built around their final resting place makes a lot of sense. It's a very solemn place. It smells very old in a really good way. A lot of history feels like is in here. Reminds me of a lot of buildings I grew up going into in Flint, Michigan. Very old buildings, but yeah. Anyway, very, very beautiful building and final resting place. Well, I certainly enjoyed my visit to the Dwight D. Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum. If you want to visit them, you should. It's right here in Abilene, Kansas. They are open every day, 10 to 4:30 or 5, something like that. And you should come check them out. Support these presidential museums. I think it's really neat that they procure presidential history. It's a really specific form of U.S. history that goes through everything. So I think that's what I like about it. But anyway, hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I did, and we'll see you on down the road. Bye now.